Ever get that feeling? Like there are these powerful but hidden forces shaping the world around us.
I think I know what you mean.
Like we're trying to understand a giant machine but can only see the gears from a distance.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're diving into today.
Okay.
Realism in international relations.
Lots to unpack
I
there.
bet. Our listeners send in tons of Wikipedia excerpts on this, so let's untangle it all together. What do you say?
Sounds like a plan, and you're in the right place to do it. Realism can feel pretty dense when you're first starting out, but,
Yeah,
it gives you a surprisingly clear lens for understanding, well,
go on.
why countries act the way they do on the world stage. It's true. And it's not just some abstract theory. It's not stuck in some dusty textbook. Realism is rooted in a view of human nature, how people are, and international politics. And that's been around for centuries. This deep dive, we're going all the way back to ancient Greece.
You're talking about Thucydides, right? Writing about the Peloponnesian War. But, what's amazing is how his insights about power and self-interest, that constant potential for conflict,
Yeah.
they still resonate even today.
It's like he looked at the world back then and saw the same basic dynamics we see playing out on the news today.
Yep.
Like nothing's changed. Exactly. Like really basic stuff. The core tenets of realism, the stuff that Thucydides was getting at, they're still the foundation.
Yeah.
We're talking about the idea that states, countries, those are the primary players in the world, right? And they're all driven by this desire for survival.
Yep.
In a system where there's no ultimate authority.
Right. No one's in charge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's anarchy out there.
Ugh.
Every country for itself.
Every country for itself. It's a scary thought.
It is. It is. And since there's no global police force, no one to enforce the rules, states have to look out for their own security and their own interests.
I guess that makes sense.
And they do that primarily through, accumulating power.
Power. Right.
Whether that's military strength, economic clout, or even, diplomatic influence.
So you're saying that it's not necessarily that world leaders are waking up every day thinking, how can I be the most powerful?
Right.
It's more like they're operating within a system that kind of forces their hand.
Yeah, and in that system, accumulating power is the most rational way to ensure their survival.
Survival of the fittest, basically.
It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Now, of course, how states define their interests and how they go about achieving them, well, that can be very different.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
That's where all the different branches of realism emerge.
Each one taking a slightly different view on how this all plays out.
And one of the most influential figures in shaping how we even understand all of this is Hans Morgenthau.
Right? Oh, absolutely.
With his 6 principles of political realism.
Huge. It's a big one.
It's amazing how he lays out this framework for thinking about how states behave.
He was a pivotal figure in classical realism. His principles, they go right to the core of how this whole school of thought views international relations.
Okay.
One that I always find fascinating, and I think your listeners will too, is this idea, this assertion that realism acknowledges the moral significance of political action.
Okay.
But it also recognizes the necessity for immorality in successful politics.
Well, hold on. Let's unpack that.
Yeah.
So he's not saying it's okay for states to just be immoral, is he?
No, not quite. What Morgenthau was getting at was that while states should definitely strive to be moral, the pursuit of national interest, especially in a system of anarchy, often requires making tough choices.
Choices that might not be, how should I put it, conventionally moral.
Exactly, but they might be necessary for survival.
So it's this tension, right, between what's ideally right and what's, I don't know, pragmatically necessary in a world with such high stakes.
You've got it. And it's something that every single leader has to grapple with. But, classical realism, it has its limitations.
Yeah.
Some critics argue that it puts too much emphasis on human nature as the sole driver of conflict.
Okay.
And that it overlooks other things, like how the international system is structured in the first place. And that's where neorealism comes in.
Okay.
Or structural realism, if you prefer.
2 names, same thing. Got it.
You could think of it like an evolution of realist thought.
Okay.
It still emphasizes power and conflict. Those are still the big ones. But it kind of shifts the focus from human nature to the actual structure of the international system itself.
So instead of zeroing in on individual leaders or states and their choices,
Right.
like saying, oh, they're being aggressive just because of human nature,
Exactly, yeah.
neorealism takes a step back, like it zooms out to get the bigger picture.
You got it. Neorealists argue that it's the structure of the international system itself.
Okay.
That's the problem.
And what is that structure?
Anarchy. The fact that there's no global authority to really enforce the rules.
Right, right, anarchy. So that forces states to put their own security first above everything else.
Exactly. It's not about like good or bad intentions, it's about survival.
Because in this system, no one is coming to save you.
You are on your own. A good example, a classic example, is the security dilemma.
Security dilemma. Tell me more.
So states, they can never be 100% sure about another state's true intentions.
I guess that's fair.
Even if you're just doing something defensive, right?
Okay.
Like shoring up your defenses, building up your military a bit. Others might see that and freak out.
They'll be like, why are they doing that? What are they planning?
Exactly. It can come across as threatening.
Even if you're just trying to protect yourself?
Yep. And that can lead to a spiral.
A spiral of what?
Well, they see you building up, so they build up their militaries too.
And then it just keeps going.
Suspicion and escalation, it's hard to stop.
And a perfect example of that would be?
The Cold War arms race.
Yeah.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Textbook case, they had enough to destroy each other like a million times over.
Exactly. Both sides, they just wanted to be safe. But every action led to a reaction.
And ultimately, it made everyone less safe.
Exactly. A vicious cycle, right?
Fueled by a lack of trust.
Yeah.
Which is just built into this system.
It's baked right in.
Now, I'm curious about something. Within neorealism, is there any debate about, well, how much states are driven by this need for security?
Oh, absolutely. It's not a monolithic theory. There are different camps within neorealism.
Like what?
Well, you've got defensive realists.
Okay, what do they think?
Think Kenneth Waltz. They argue that states are mainly, security maximizers.
They just want enough power to feel safe.
Enough to deter anyone from attacking them and to protect what they already have.
But they're not looking to take over the world.
Right. They're not inherently aggressive, just trying to maintain the balance of power.
Makes sense. So who else is there?
Well, then you've got the offensive realists.
Okay, I'm guessing they're a bit more, shall we say, assertive.
A bit more, yeah. The big name there is John Mearsheimer. He argues that states can't help themselves.
Can't help themselves how?
They're always driven to get more power.
More.
They want regional hegemony, if not global.
They want to rule the world. I could see why someone would think that in a system with no rules, it makes sense to be the biggest, baddest one on the block.
Right, exactly. If there's no one to stop you, why not? And history gives us a lot of examples of states with expansionist ambitions.
So how do we reconcile these two views? Are states just trying to survive, or are they hardwired for domination?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's probably somewhere in between. And, it's likely that there's always more to the story, always more going on behind the scenes.
And that's where our next theory comes in.
You got it. Neoclassical realism tries to bridge that gap, offering a perspective that's a little bit more, well, nuanced.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
Tell me more about how neoclassical realism helps us make sense of international relations.
It agrees that the international system matters.
Okay.
But it says we can't ignore what's going on inside the state.
We have to look inside the black box.
Exactly. Domestic politics, the leaders themselves, their personalities, their own perceptions of the outside world.
It's not just about how the system pressures them from the outside.
Right. It's about how they react, what's going on internally. All of it factors into their foreign policy.
So even if two states face a similar threat,
Yeah.
they might react in completely opposite ways.
It happens all the time.
Depending on what their internal politics are like, what their leaders believe, even what interest groups have power.
All of that. And this is where those 4 variations of state balancing behavior come into play. Remember those?
Oh, yeah. From the Wikipedia excerpts our listeners sent.
Appropriate balancing, overbalancing, underbalancing, and of course, non-balancing.
So many ways to react. I've always found it fascinating how neoclassical realism tries to explain what seems like totally irrational behavior.
It happens all the time in international politics.
Give me an example. How would it explain something like that?
Let's take overbalancing.
Okay.
Say a country freaks out about a perceived threat and goes way overboard. Neoclassical realism would be like, hold on a minute, maybe the threat isn't actually that serious.
So why are they acting like it is?
It might be domestic political pressure.
Interesting.
Maybe the leaders are misinterpreting things, getting bad intel. Or maybe powerful lobbies are pushing for a certain agenda.
So they're pouring tons of resources into their military, maybe even bankrupting themselves, but the threat isn't even real.
It might be real, but it might be exaggerated because of all this other stuff going on internally. Or How about underbalancing?
Okay, remind me what that one was again.
That's when a state just totally fails to see the threat coming. Or they see it and just don't do enough.
They're just ignoring the warning signs.
Maybe neoclassical realism would say, well, maybe their leaders are clueless.
Out of touch with what's really happening out there.
Exactly. Or maybe the public just doesn't want to hear it.
They're tired of war, tired of spending money on defense.
They just want to focus on things at home. It happens.
It really shows you how much those internal and external factors
Yeah.
are always playing off each other.
Always.
It's not as simple as just states moving around on a chessboard.
Oh, it's way more complicated than that.
It's personalities and domestic politics and just like how everyone sees the world, right?
Yeah.
All of that goes into every decision.
It's messy.
And that messiness, that's what neoclassical realism tries to capture.
Exactly. And I think it helps us go beyond these simplistic explanations of what's going on.
Yeah, it's not just, oh, that country is aggressive because of this one thing.
Right. It's always more than that. Neoclassical realism tries to embrace that real-world messiness.
It's a good reality check. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We started with classical realism, then neorealism, and now neoclassical realism. What's the key takeaway? Why should our listeners care about any of this?
Because realism, in all its different forms, gives us a framework
A framework for
understanding the forces that shape the world we live in. It helps us understand conflict, why there's so much competition, why cooperation is so hard.
especially in a world where there's no one in charge.
Exactly. No global referee to break up the fights.
It's like realism gives you this new pair of glasses.
Okay, I like that.
And suddenly you can see through the fog of what's happening internationally. You can understand why countries do what they do,
Even when it seems completely bonkers, right?
especially when it seems bonkers. But, it's a little humbling too, don't you think?
How so?
Well, realism reminds us that even now, in the 21st century, with all this amazing technology in the UN and global trade, those basic instincts, they're still there.
Power and self-interest, those drives are powerful.
They're not going anywhere.
Nope. And it's easy to forget that, to think we've moved past all that. But if we want to make the world a better place, we have to understand how those forces are still working.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into realism, what's one last thought you'd leave our listeners with? What should they be thinking about?
I tell them to look at the world through this lens.
The realism lens.
Yeah. Think about how it can explain what's going on today. Why are we seeing new powers rising up? Why is there still so much conflict? Why is it so hard to solve big problems?
Like climate change.
Exactly. Realism helps us understand why all of that is so complicated. It reminds us that cooperation, it has its limits.
It's a call to action.
In a way, yes, engage with the world.
Be realistic.
But don't give up hope. We can work toward a better future, but we have to be clear-eyed about the challenges.
Well said. This has been a great conversation. I hope it sparks some curiosity in our listeners.
Me too. There's so much more to learn.
We've only scratched the surface.
Just a tiny scratch.
But hopefully, our listeners feel ready to go out there and do some exploring of their own.
That's what we're here for.
Until next time, keep asking those big questions and never stop diving deep into the ideas that make our world tick.